The money that I inherited from my parents, from my uncle, felt like the dragon in the Hobbit. I felt like I had this hoard of jewels and money and wealth that I'm guarding over. The goal of having that money is to have it get bigger and bigger and bigger.
This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and does not constitute investment, legal, or tax advice. Listening does not create an advisory relationship.
Hello, I'm Peterson Toscano.
And I'm Diana Yañez.
This is Season 6, Episode 4 of the Quakers Today podcast, a project of Friends Publishing Corporation.
This season, we are talking about Quakers and money. Last month, we took on capitalism. Not in some abstract way, but by asking what it means for friends to live with integrity in a system that, in my opinion, is shaped by extraction, inequality, colonialism, and environmental harm.
And Diana, near the end of that episode, the last episode, you introduced us to Fran Brokaw. And we only heard a little from her then, but the image she used stayed with me, how her inherited wealth was like sitting on a dragon's hoard.
Yes, Fran is a Quaker who inherited significant wealth. And over time, she began to ask deeper questions about it. Not only how should I invest this, but what is this money? Where did it come from? What has it meant in my life? And what does faithfulness ask of me now? What moved me from this conversation was that she did not talk about it as a finished project or a perfect formula. She talked about a process that included learning, discomfort, grief, accountability, and eventually releasing money in ways that changed her.
And unlike our earlier episode, we're going to just focus on Fran. She's our main guest, our one guest, and I really appreciate going deep into her own story. Season 6 of Quakers Today is sponsored by the American Friends Service Committee and Friends Fiduciary. Thank you for your ongoing support.
Friends Fiduciary is a sponsor of this podcast. Sponsorship does not constitute an endorsement, and we do not receive compensation based on listener investment decisions.
All right. So, Diana, we're on a journey here. And in the last episode, we were talking about capitalism and how so much of the world's wealth has been built at the expense of other people and the environment. And for me, it feels overwhelming, right? Seeing the pain and the suffering that comes from greed and concepts like unlimited growth and a single bottom line of profit over everything else. It causes pain.
It can. And that is one reason Fran's story felt so important to me. She brings the question down into one life, into family money and the emotional meaning that money can have. As they say, in the deeply personal lies the universal.
Yeah, and in her case, money is not just numbers in an account. It's also memory. For Fran, it represented safety and grief. With money come the stories we hear and tell ourselves, along with the shock that comes when we realize the stories are not always true.
Fran told me that a major turning point came through a course with Melchor Quick Hall called Aiming for Justice, Race, Reparations, and Right Paths. The course asks participants to look directly at money, what it means, where it came from, and what repair might require.
For Fran, that meant looking at inherited wealth without the usual comforting explanations.
Melchor got us to think deeply about money, what it means to us, and how it came to us. And I had already been doing a lot of thinking about this sort of privilege that I have been born into. The whole thing of inherited wealth really hit me. What Melchor opened for me is that the wealth that I have and that I inherited is really wealth that represents stolen land and stolen labor. Although my ancestors may not have owned slaves, I don't have evidence that any of them did. Even if they were all in the North, they were involved with mills and other things that, as good Quakers, they were making money with. That was bolstered by a slave economy and was done by forcing out the indigenous inhabitants of the country and of the land that they were occupying, that they were living on, that they worked on. It made me feel initially guilty, but then realizing that I'm not guilty of owning other people or pushing people off their land. I benefit from it every day, and I have benefited from it all my life.
That distinction feels important. Listen, Fran is not saying I personally did these bad things. She's saying I benefit from them.
Yes, and I think that is where the spiritual work began for her. Guilt can really freeze a person, but responsibility can move a person. Melchor's course gave Fran and the other participants practical experience, not just ideas to agree with.
Yeah, so what did that look like?
It started with giving money away in ways that challenged the habits most of us are taught to keep, like control and oversight, and the unspoken assumption that the giver decides what counts as a good use of the money they gave.
The course was titled Aiming for Justice, Race, Reparations, and Right Paths. I took it 3 years in a row. In the first year, it was choosing a person of color that we know and sending some amount of money out of the blue to them unasked. The second year, we were asked to raise a particular amount of money and commit to giving money to a group. And the third year, to raise money and to donate it to a neighborhood of people. In that case, it was her neighborhood that she grew up in Washington, D.C., which is a predominantly Black neighborhood, and to give them money. And it was substantial amounts of money. I think the first year she didn't put a dollar tag on it. The second year, the amount that I donated was probably $1,000. This third year, $5,000. I learned that in reparations, my role is to release that money, not to have strings attached. That I don't need to know how that money gets spent. It's not my responsibility to see that it gets spent in a way that I would approve of, and that it goes to people who've been affected, and that they would then choose how that money is used.
That's the part that gets me. I can imagine giving money away and then totally wanting to manage it from a distance.
Yeah, definitely. And that is why this is not only about generosity, it's about power. Who gets to decide? Who has to submit a report before someone believes they can use money wisely? Who has the power?
And for friends, Quakers, Quaker meetings, that raises all kinds of questions. We talk a lot about equality and community, but money, wow, that quickly puts us right back into a hierarchy.
Exactly. And once Fran started seeing that more clearly, she also started seeing the emotional posture she had toward the money itself.
The first year I was in this workshop with her, I came home from it seeing the money that I inherited from my parents, from my uncle. It felt like in The Hobbit, the dragon in The Hobbit, and I felt like I had this hoard of jewels and money and wealth that I'm guarding over, and that the goal of having that money is to have it get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah, this image is so useful. I mean, it's funny in a way, but it's also painfully accurate. The dragon doesn't need the treasure. The dragon is not enjoying the treasure. The dragon just sits there guarding the treasure. And whenever the dragon does leave the lair, its mind is just fixated on the money, worrying someone's going to steal it. The treasure totally defines the dragon's purpose in life. Which sounds extreme until I think about how normal it is to treat the accumulation as the goal, right? We save, invest, grow, and protect it, and then we pass it on to whoever. So Fran considered a question, though, that interrupted the cycle. She asked herself, what is this money for?
Yeah, Fran began to question that Scrooge McDuck instinct in a very concrete way. One example came when her family sold a house in Vermont that her parents had built as a retirement home.
My siblings and I decided it was time to sell a house that our parents had built. We sold the house. I took the portion that I received. I thought about how to give it to the people whose land the house is on, the original caretakers of the land, the Abenaki people. I took my proceeds on that sale and gave it to Northeast Farmers of Color Land Grant. They help with land back movements for Indigenous tribes and groups. They provide monetary assistance as well as advice, teaching, material assistance to farmers of color all over. That's probably one of the bigger gifts that I have given through this new way of seeing finances.
That takes the question of where did this money come from, and it makes it specific.
And specificity matters. It can be easy to talk about repair in broad moral language. Fran is asking, what came to me from this particular place, and where might it need to go now?
Even then, it doesn't sound like it became easy.
No, she was very honest about that. Even after all this work, she still notices the old reflexes.
The money that I have should be a community asset. And I'm using the word should because it's very easy with any racism work for me as a white woman to slide into the comfortable understanding of the world that I was given as I grew up. I find myself at times thinking about giving money to a group, a person, or school, whatever, and thinking, "Oh, that's a lot of money." And then I think, "Is this my money? It shouldn't belong to me. It should go through me. It should be channeled. I can channel it as energy, as love, and not hoard it, not let it just sit in a brokerage account or the image that I would like to have is me more as someone who receives and passes on rather than the dragon who sits on her hoard and only wants to see it get bigger and bigger.
I personally appreciate that Fran admits the reflex is still there. Like, that's a lot of money. I mean, I know that voice, definitely not on the scale Fran is talking about, but I know the instinct to tighten my grip when money is involved. In fact, I'll sometimes think, oh, I want to donate $100 to something. And then I'm like, well, I guess 75's okay. Or maybe 50. I just kind of whittle my way down.
Yeah, and that's the reason that I want listeners to hear this not only as an episode for people with large inheritances, but for all of us. All of us are taught to have that Scrooge McDuck instinct. It's really part of our culture and society.
Especially for those of us in the United States. We may not all feel wealthy compared to our neighbors, but come on. Compared with the rest of the world, many of us have forms of wealth we barely recognize. Consider stable housing, right? That's a form of wealth. Education, citizenship, retirement accounts, family support, access to credit, and even the absence of debt.
And remember to be aware if guilt comes up, because guilt can freeze us. This is really much more about responsibility. So just remember that if guilt comes up, okay, but that's not what we're trying to instigate in listeners, right? We're not trying to get everyone to feel guilty. So Fran had already tried to bring her values into her financial life in a way she had begun where many of us began, by asking what her money was invested in.
I was very aware of not wanting money that I invested to go to tobacco, firearms, military spending. I got out of the fossil fuel industry and a number of things like that. But that's really not enough because the goal is still to grow the money and keep it under my control.
And that sounds like faithfulness to me. Fran was trying to make sure her money did less harm.
Yes, and that matters. Ethical investing. As an investment advisor, I can say that ethical investing is a very meaningful beginning. Fran is not dismissing that. She is saying that for her, it became clear there was another question underneath it.
Yeah, not only what companies am I invested in, but why am I still organizing my financial life around keeping this money under my control? Ouch.
And that is where her Quaker values started pushing her beyond screening investments and toward releasing money.
Very much my Quaker values that I believe in, the testimonies of simplicity, equity, and stewardship are things that have become much more important in managing money and giving it away.
And that lands right in the middle of our season here at Quakers Today. So the question becomes not only is my money doing harm, but also why am I holding this much? What story am I telling myself about why I need to keep it? And who is affected by my keeping it?
Those are not easy questions. And they become even more complicated when money is connected to grief or family memory. Fran told a very painful story about money she received after her father and stepmother died.
My father and stepmother were on an airplane that crashed in the ocean. Everyone died. After all the investigating was said and done, it was most likely that the co-pilot had locked the pilot out of the cabin and had intentionally crashed the plane in the ocean. My siblings and I sued the airline company and got a substantial settlement from them without them admitting that they had any fault. That money represented my father to me. It took a long time for me to let go of the money I inherited from him when he died, but that crash was in 1999, so it was a long time ago. After all the work I'd done, I was able to really just say, that money it's money, but it's not money that represents my father. It's not my father. My father was the person who was never late for work, never late for dinner, never took even a pencil from his workplace, lived by his ethics. My ethics did not include needing to hold on to that money any longer. Releasing it feels good. It feels good.
And this part of the conversation feels important because it keeps our money conversation today from becoming too neat and tidy. Money can represent harm and privilege. It also can represent love or loss, safety, or even the last tangible connection to someone who died.
When Fran said that, I heard a kind of freedom in it.
It's not like she's dismissing the grief, but she's somehow able to separate the grief from the money.
And that separation allowed her to act from her values rather than from the fear that releasing the money meant losing her father again.
Yeah. And that is another tender place in the story because for some people, money isn't only about greed or privilege, or it may not be about that at all. Sometimes it's about fear. Sometimes it's about wanting to keep a person close. Sometimes it's about trying to control a world that has already shown us how little control we have.
Yes, and Fran names that directly.
Most important things that I've been learning my adult life is that I do not control everything and that I can't control most things. I can control my intention. I can work hard for things, but I can't control outcomes. This is another step in that journey of letting go, the illusion that I can control things. I have found it very freeing, and I hope that other people are able to step into that uncomfortable place of letting go of control and the illusion that they have control. None of us get out of here alive, so do good while you can.
Do good while you can. I like that. It's not grandiose. It's not like fix the whole system by yourself. It's definitely honest, right? She's saying be honest about what is in your hands and then do the next faithful thing.
Yeah. And Fran's story gives us a few possible next faithful things. Ask where the money came from. Notice what stories and emotions are attached to it. Find people who can help you stay accountable. Practice giving without control. Let your values shape not only how money is invested, but how it moves.
Even if we don't have inherited wealth like Fran, we can still ask, what have I received that I did not earn alone? What forms of safety or access have shaped my life? What am I holding more tightly than I need to? And I appreciate your reminder not to feel guilty, because guilt often comes in for this, and shame too. And so that's a good reminder, asking these questions objectively without guilt.
Right, right. So moving past the frozen point so that you can actually take action and consider what might be possible if money became less of a guarded hoard and more of a way to repair, reconnect, and love.
Each episode of this series, we're sharing resources from the Friends Journal publishing world. And this month, we want to highlight an article by Lola George. It's entitled Money as a Mutual Blessing. Lola is one of the people you interviewed, Diana, for this season. And her article gives us language for something Fran has been showing us in her own life.
It was a pleasure to interview Lola. And she begins this article with a scene that will probably feel familiar to a lot of friends. A meeting for business where the budget comes up, and suddenly the energy in the room changes. People get anxious, people start protecting the things that matter to them. Money becomes a place where fear, scarcity, and old wounds surface.
Instead of treating that anxiety as a failure, Lola does something brilliant and asks what might happen if we approached financial relationships as opportunities for mutual blessing. She draws on George Fox's familiar phrase about answering that of God and everyone, but she doesn't leave it as a nice Quaker saying. Lola asks what it would mean if our financial dealings actually became places where we bless one another and allow ourselves to be blessed in return.
One of the sections I find especially helpful is where she talks about moving from anxiety and greed to what Walter Brueggemann calls milk and honey. That shift is a movement away from isolation and self protection and toward community, covenant, abundance, and generosity.
You can read Lola George's article, Money as a Mutual Blessing, at friendsjournal.org. We will include a direct link in the show notes at quakerstoday.org.
And as you read this article, you might ask yourself, where does money create anxiety in me or in my meeting? And what would it look like to move even a little toward mutual blessing?
We also have an outside resource. We like to look out to the world to see what else is out there. We want to talk about a game almost everybody knows, Monopoly. Not the version many of us grew up playing, where the goal is to buy up property, bankrupt your friends and family, and somehow still be invited back for dinner. We want to talk about the game that came before Monopoly. And this was your idea to bring this game to us.
Yeah, I love this origin story. So the original game was called the Landlord's Game, created by Lizzie Magie in the early 1900s. Magie was a writer, inventor, and political thinker. As far as we know, she was not a Quaker, but she did spend time in Arden, Delaware, a free-thinking community co-founded by Quaker architect William Lightfoot Price. Her game became popular in some Quaker schools and communities.
The Landlord's Game was not designed as a celebration of ruthless capitalism. It was actually meant to teach people about land, wealth, rent, and monopoly power. McGee created two sets of rules. In one version, players were rewarded together when wealth was created. In the other, players tried to create monopolies and crush their opponents.
Is anyone surprised that it's the crushing your opponents version that survived and became wildly popular? The cooperative lesson faded, and the game that most of us know is winner takes all.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I find the landlord's game useful because it turns economics into an experience. You do not only hear about land ownership, rent, or extraction, you feel, right? You feel it, how a system shapes people's behavior. And you can imagine that the rules could have been different.
Yes, and that connects directly to Fran's story. She was not only asking how to play the game more ethically, she was asking whether she needed to keep playing by the same rules anyway. Accumulation, control, inheritance, and the pressure to make that pile bigger.
Check out Lizzie McGee's The Landlord's Game. We've included links in the show notes to an article in The Guardian and to a Philadelphia yearly meeting piece about McGee, Quakers, and an Atlantic City connection.
And maybe the next time you see a Monopoly board, you can ask, what economic lesson am I learning here? And what would happen if we changed the rules?
For you listening, thank you for joining Diana and me for this episode of Quakers Today. Diana, thank you. This is a real genuine journey for me. You have no idea the kind of questions I've been asking, and I'll have an article in Friends Journal about it soon. If you don't know, we have a monthly column that we're putting in that coincides with this series. A very special thank you to Fran Brokaw for sharing so much of her story with us. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
You will find show notes, links, and a full transcript of this episode over at quakerstoday.org. You can also watch a video version of this episode, including the interview I had with Fran, on the Friends Journal YouTube page.
I want to give many thanks to listeners leaving comments on our TikTok and Instagram page, and to the listeners who left voicemails. We enjoy sharing your thoughts, questions, and insights.
Please consider leaving your own voicemail for us to share with listeners. What financial practices align with your values? Call and leave a message at 317 Quakers. That's 317 782 5377. +1 if you're calling from outside the U.S. The number again is 317 Quakers.
You can also email Diana and me. That email address is podcast@friendsjournal.org. Podcast@friendsjournal.org. Is there any way to email that dog that's barking in your neighborhood and just thanking it for co-hosting with us?
That is our 9:28 a.m. dog. We have another one that will be barking at 9:33.
You can find out all the ways to contact us in our show notes. Just visit our website, quakerstoday.org. Season 6 of Quakers Today is sponsored by Friends Fiduciary. Friends Fiduciary unites Quaker values with expert investing. They serve more than 460 organizations with ethical portfolios, shareholder advocacy, and a deep commitment to justice and sustainability. At Friends Fiduciary, investing is about maximizing returns to support your mission, and it's also about your values. For over 125 years, Friends Fiduciary has provided affordable, professional investment management to meetings, churches, and schools. Today, they manage $800 million in assets for over 460 organizations. Learn more at friendsfiduciary.org.
This season of Quakers Today is also sponsored by the American Friends Service Committee, AFSC. The American Friends Service Committee works with communities worldwide to challenge injustice, meet urgent community needs, and build conditions for lasting peace. Since 1948, AFSC has worked for a just and lasting peace in Palestine and Israel. Today, its Gaza team has delivered aid to over 1 million displaced Palestinians. In the U.S. and across the world, AFSC is working with Quaker meetings, other faith groups, and communities of conscience to advocate for an end to the genocide, to cut all ties with Israeli apartheid and build an apartheid-free world. Join the movement by writing a minute to identify your community as apartheid-free. Visit afsc.org/apartheid-free for more info.
Diana, our next episode, I'm so excited about. We have interviews that you've done and that I've done and we've done together. Well, what's happening next episode?
We're looking at Quakers and reparations. How do we actually repair, and how can money help us repair?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Thank you, friend, for spending this time with us.
May you grow in creativity, curiosity, and compassion.
Before we end, could you just give us a big, robust disclaimer? Because I love these disclaimers so much. They just add so much beauty to the show.
They're part of my fiduciary responsibility. So remember that all investments involve risk, and decisions should be made based on your individual circumstances, ideally in consultation with a qualified professional. The views expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the host, Natural Investments, or its affiliates. And yes, sometimes I do sound like a pharmaceutical rep, but
Yeah. Listening to this episode will lead to
bleeding
more empathy.
incontinence.
Hopefully not. We haven't had a question of the month like normal, but there's a general question. What do you have to say about money? What are some lessons that you've learned, some insights that you've gained? Find out how you can leave your own message. Visit quakerstoday.org.